New Westminster, Burnaby.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate that, and I would like to say right at the beginning that I'm sharing my time with the really effective and remarkably hardworking Member of Parliament for Cowichan, Malahat and Langford. And he'll be speaking after me. Mr. Speaker, it's no secret we'll be supporting the bill because of the NDP amendments. Historically now, for the first time since Confederation, we now have provision for most Canadian workers for sick leave. And we also, the NDP amendments also achieved forcing the government back on what it was trying to do, which was actually cut back on the amount of money that is going to families who are desperately trying to keep food on the table and keep a roof over the head. So for those reasons, we will be supportive. But we deplore how this government took it to the precipice, took it to the edge of the cliff. That at a time when so many Canadian families are struggling, they left over 1 million Canadian families not knowing on Sunday night as the emergency benefits expired whether or not they would actually have the wherewithal to feed their families. And so that is what we deplore, Mr. Speaker, that this government didn't think about the impacts of what its actions were and its lack of action for the many, many families across the country impacted by the decisions of the last few weeks. Now, the Prime Minister wanted to avoid the controversy of the many scandals that we've seen erupting around the COVID funding, but the government didn't think about the impact on regular Canadian families. We deplore that, Mr. Speaker. And I'd like to devote most of my brief few minutes today to another deplorable fact, and that is this government's treatment of people with disabilities. Now, we'll recall, Mr. Speaker, that as the pandemic hit, the government took about 4 days to put in place an aid package, not for people with disabilities or seniors or anyone else, but for Canada's big banks.
That's right.
$750 billion, an unbelievable amount, $750 billion in liquidity supports being provided to Canada's immensely profitable banking sector. Now, there were no conditions attached to that. It was just a massive handout of largesse and support for the banking sector. And since then, of course, we've seen banks in Canada racking up during a pandemic when people are struggling, when businesses are closing, over $15 billion of profits so far, just in the last 6 months.
Shameful.
And so we can see how this government can act with alacrity when it wants to. When banking lobbyists come, hey, there's no holds barred. They just provide the hundreds of billions of dollars in liquidity supports that the banking sector is asking for. And we've seen the massive increase in inequality across the length and breadth of this country because of that alacrity to always respond to the rich and the well-connected. 20 billionaires in Canada increasing their wealth again over the course of this pandemic, the last 6 months, with so many families struggling, so many businesses, small businesses, in my riding and in ridings right across the country, struggling to avoid that tragic moment when they close the door and turn the key for the last time and walk away from what is often a lifetime's investment. And yet, 20 billionaires have increased by $37 billion their wealth. So let's contrast that with the situation of people with disabilities in this country. And Mr. Speaker, as you may be aware, I worked with people with disabilities in British Columbia, helped to found the Disability Employment Network. What we found was there are so many obstacles put in the place of Canadians with disabilities across this country. If we could prioritize accessibility in this country, we would be seeing a country that is vastly different than what it is now. And what it is now is half of the people who have to go to food banks to make ends meet are people with disabilities. More than half of the homeless, people that are sleeping in street corners and in parks across this country, are people with disabilities. That should be a source of shame to every single one of us in this House and every single Canadian across this country.
That's right.
So we believed that things needed to change. And so we moved immediately. In April, as you'll recall, Mr. Speaker, we brought forward a motion. And the motion was that the government proceed without delay to providing emergency supports to people with disabilities. It passed on April 29th, unanimously. Every single member of Parliament in this House said that has to be a priority. And then nothing happened for weeks and weeks. As the pandemic increased, as people struggled, as people with disabilities who are seeing increased expenses were trying to figure out how they could make ends meet for another month, the government sat for about a month and a half before it endeavored to bring forward legislation that missed the vast majority of people with disabilities. And we said this is not good enough. And we sat down, as you'll recall, Mr. Speaker, in July. The member from Elmwood-Transcona provided very important guidance to the minister and to the government on how to set up a system, and we achieved in July, as you know, Mr. Speaker, a bill that provided supports to most people with disabilities. To our chagrin, we found out that a vast number of people with disabilities are not even coded in the federal system. You would think, Mr. Speaker, that that would mean that Cabinet and the government would act immediately. If we're missing a third of people with disabilities, let's code them into the system so that we can provide supports for all. But no, that never happened. Shame. We still got the legislation through the House in July. The member from Elmwood-Transcona said if you code it now, at least the people who are registered in the federal system will get their supports at the end of August. That was good direction. That was good advice. And we got the legislation through. This is phase 2 now. We've been waiting since April. And now, Mr. Speaker, we are 1 day away from the month of October. The banking sector received $750 billion in liquidity supports in 4 days, and Canadians with disabilities struggling to keep a roof over their heads, struggling to put food on the table, have not received 1 cent. Mr. Speaker, this isn't something that is partisan. Every single one of us in here, every single one of the members of Parliament that are listening right now on Zoom, we should all be ashamed of what the results have been. That the most disadvantaged people in our country have not received 1 cent of support in the greatest pandemic that we have seen in over a century. That should shock all of us. That should make all of us ashamed. And yet, nothing happens. We raise this issue continuously. We've negotiated now 3 agreements where the government has agreed to provide the supports. Parliament as a whole said back in April, without delay, let's get this support out to people with disabilities across the country, and yet nothing has happened.
What does it take?
Now, Mr. Speaker, I am ashamed. And I can tell you, members of this NDP caucus, we're ready right now to go across the street, to go to CRA. If it takes to licking stamps, if there's not enough stamps in the checks, we'll send them out. If the checks haven't been printed, we'll help any way we can. We want to make sure that money gets in the hands of people with disabilities immediately. There can be no excuse for any further delay. This has been the biggest shame, I believe, of the pandemic, that the government for 6 months has done nothing to support the ones who are most in need. Now, I will say this, Mr. Speaker. I am optimistic for the long term. I see disability activists stepping forward and speaking out with powerful voices like never before. I'm thinking of people like Penelope and Maddie and Nunya, Mundy and Patrick and Sarah. These are disability activists who are making people through social media aware of what their daily life and struggles are like. And so I am optimistic, despite what is a source, I believe, of national shame, that eventually we will get to the point where people with disabilities will have the same rights in Canada that they have in other countries, the same accessibility, that we will end the practice of ramps that end with 2 stairs, or deaf events with American Sign Language interpreters and nobody from the deaf community has been invited, or big signs in Braille at the entrance of colleges and universities, but when you go inside, there's no accessibility there. And that we will build the kind of inclusive society where Canadians with disabilities can contribute as they want to do and as they can if we eliminate the obstacles to the growth and the betterment of our country. But it starts with providing those supports now, Mr. Speaker. The government has no excuse for delay. Let's get that support in the hands of people with disabilities immediately so that they have the wherewithal to get through the next period of this pandemic. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.